Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Yud Aleph. This week's learning is sponsored by Jason and Danielle Friedman in honor of Oliver Friedman's upcoming bar mitzvah. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with the end of yesterday's daf, and I did a chart on today's study guide to review the end of yesterday's daf that we kind of rushed through at the end. I just want to talk about the main concept of it. I'm not going to go through the details again, but the main concept that we started with toward the bottom of Yud Amud Bet is that when the mazik pays the nizak, okay, let's use an example of Ruth damaged Naomi's property. When Ruth pays, okay, whether it's, again, her animal, her vessels, whatever it might be, when Ruth pays Naomi the amount, she pays the amount it was worth from the beginning and deducts the value of what it's worth now. So if whatever's left of the item is still worth something, whether it's the nevela of a dead animal, that's the main example they're bringing, she only pays the difference. So yesterday we brought an example, it was worth 300 and now it's only worth 100, but it is still worth 100. So Ruth only has to pay $200. Okay, now this is what we call, and the main thing is Naomi gets left with the dead animal, which she really has nothing to do with. So she's going to have to sell it, but the onus is on her to sell it. So then we said we learned it from 3 different verses, which all related to 3 different cases. And then we tried to say, why couldn't we learn one from the other? Why do we need all 3? Because theoretically, you would have thought that maybe, right, the more the mazik is responsible, the more we would have thought that maybe the mazik has to sell the nevela and deal with that. And actually, maybe Ruth would need to reimburse Naomi the full amount. The more we put the responsibility on Ruth and for what she did wrong, let's say Makeh Be'ema, for example, is she did it with her own hands. She attacked, she personally caused damage to Naomi's animal. Maybe you would think then, right, the onus would be on her. And that's why each case, right, was saying, even though for whatever reason, each time you might think the onus was more on Ruth, no, in the end, the halacha is by all 3 cases, Naomi's going to be left with the nevela. Now the Gemara is going to say, okay, we're starting from 5 lines from the bottom of the daf, at least I'm in my Gemara. Amalei Rav Kahana LeRav. Rav Kahana is saying to Rav, now we're just taking the pasuk about the boar. Hameti yelo, which again means Hameti yelo. That means Naomi, the one whose shore was damaged, she gets left with the shore. Okay, so in this case, it was a boar case, that pasuk, right? So kesef yashiv leBaalav. So Ruth has to pay Naomi because Ruth dug a pit and Naomi's animal fell in. Ruth has to pay Naomi the damages. But then it says Hameti yelo, but Naomi keeps the animal, which was the whole halacha that we just learned. Well, now they're going to say the following. This assumes that because it says Hameti yelo, Naomi gets it. Were it not for that, you would have assumed that Ruth has to pay the full value of the animal, 300, which seems reasonable, right? If I had asked you, again, we talked about this yesterday, you would have said, of course, Ruth has to pay the full value of the animal. We didn't think, oh, you're going to leave Naomi with that dead animal and she'll have to deal with it. Well, they're not questioning it. Would you really have thought that if we didn't have this pasuk, they're now saying you really, without that, we actually would have thought that the nevela goes to the mazik? Would you really have thought that? Would you really have thought that Ruth ends up with the dead animal and Ruth has to compensate Naomi for the full amount? Really? Well, now we're going to prove that there's no way you would have thought that. It's obvious that Naomi gets left with the dead animal and Ruth just pays the difference. Why? Well, this is going to go back to a sugya we already saw. If you remember, what did we say? Kesef yashiv leBaalav, the beginning part of that pasuk taught you. If Ruth wanted to, she could pay Naomi just in bran, right? Which means if she had 3 treifa animals, meaning 3 dead animals, okay? Or however we use the word treifa here. But let's assume, okay, Ruth had 3 dead carcasses, animal carcasses in her house, and each one was worth 100. She could definitely pay in dead carcasses. So if that's the case, since she could pay in subin, she can pay in animal carcasses, which means that Ruth theoretically, not theoretically, if Naomi is left with the dead animal, we're going to leave Naomi with that dead animal, and Ruth is only going to have to pay her $200 and not 3 full $100 and keep the dead animal. Because if Ruth can pay her with the dead animal, obviously she can leave the dead animal in Naomi's hands and only pay her the difference. So therefore, why is there even a drasha of a Hameti yelo? What is it to teach you if not the halacha that we just said, which there's no reason to teach you that? So they're going to have to modify a little, and they're going to tell you, fine. So it's definitely obvious. You don't need the pasuk to tell you that Naomi gets left with her dead animal. And it's, even though it wasn't her fault the damage happened, she's left with the dead animal. If she wants the value of the money, she's got to go sell it in the shuk. But what's it coming to teach you? Hameki yellow, that Naomi keeps the dead animal. What it's to tell you is, okay, let's go back to our example. Ruth damaged an animal that originally was worth 300. Now it's dead, it's 100. Ruth has to pay 200. But what if by the time Ruth and Naomi get to court, as we all know, that could take a while, the carcass is now only worth 80. It goes down in value. Does Ruth have to pay 220, or does she only pay 200, from the time of the accident, or whatever it was? So the answer is the pchat nevela, the depreciation of the nevela, is hamei yellow. That means on Naomi, on the damaged one, the mei yellow, the depreciation is on her, meaning it goes by the value at the time of the death of the animal. So if the animal, was 100 at the time of the death, then that's the amount Ruth is going to have to pay. She's not going to have to pay any more than the 200, even if the animal goes down in value by the time they get to court. Okay, that's called pchat nevela. That pchat is depreciation. So that's the depreciation of the nevela is on the nisa. Okay, so again, even though the mazik, we started off in the beginning of the Masechet with the mazik has to pay with the best of their land. Their hand is right there, yadam ala tachtona, as we say. Right, you get the worst because you damage someone's property. In the end, we see, well, it's not so bad because in this area, the carcass is valued at the moment of the death of the animal and not at the moment of the ruling in the court. Okay, now the Gemara is going to ask, Lema pchat nevela tannaitic. Is it possible that there's a debate about who the pchat nevela is on? Maybe Ruth does have to pay 220 according to one opinion. Let's see. Ditanya says in a bright. This is a pasuk we saw before, just talking about a shomer sachar, someone who gets paid to watch someone's animal or item, whatever it is, and then some accident happens or something happens, and they, get stolen, whatever it is. Okay, so then it says, so in this case, it's some crazy, animal came by and attacked the animal that they were watching. It says, Yabihu ed. So now, we darshan this in a particular way before. Now we're going to see two other ways of darshaning it. Yavi edim. What does it mean, yavi ed? And this is really the simple reading of the pasuk. A shomer sachar, if you get paid to watch someone's animal, so you're responsible, a high level of responsibility, because you were getting paid to do the job. So if you didn't do the job well, you're responsible. The only thing you're not responsible for is onus. If some crazy thing happened, like a lion ran out of the zoo and started, and ran around and attacked the animal. Totally unexpected. So what does it mean, Yavi ed? Yavi edim shenitrefa ba'ones upatur. Now, Yavi ehu sounds like you bring the animal as proof. But here, it's not the animal you're going to bring as proof. You have to bring witnesses that this animal was attacked unexpectedly, totally crazy circumstances. And then you'll be patur. Okay, fine. That has nothing to do with our topic, really. Let's see. Abshaul yavi aduda lebetin. Okay, what is aduda? Aduda is the carcass. Now, why are you going to bring the carcass to court? If not to prove what the value of the animal is. Now, what it means here is, what he's saying is the mazik, okay, so you're the shomer, you got paid, okay. Ruth was paid to watch Naomi's animal, and something happened to the animal. Ruth, now in this case, we're assuming it's a case where Ruth is responsible, because most cases are, right, it wasn't onus. Let's say this animal came and attacked in a normal kind of way, and Ruth just had to put a gate around the animal, and some other animal came in and attacked it. Well, Ruth should right away bring the animal to the court to assess its value right now, the carcass, because the depreciation is going to be on the nizak, right, on Naomi. So Ruth better bring that right now. In other words, you should bring it right now, because if you bring it right now, we'll have the value of it right now. Okay, and that's the idea here, that Ruth should bring it to the court because she wants to pay the least possible amount. So if she brings it right away, it'll be assessed right now at what it is. And that's then she can deduct the amount, even if by the time the court rules, the animal's already depreciated. So the fact that Abba Shaul explains the pasuk this way and Tanna Kamma doesn't, must mean that they argue over this issue. My laba kamiflage, is this not the root of their machloket? Timar savar pchat nevela denizakave. Umar savar dimazikave. So Tanakama thinks it's actually on the mazik. And that's why she doesn't have to rush to bring it to court, because no matter what, it's only once the court rules that we're going to assess the value of the animal. And then they'll assess and figure out what the value of the animal. But Ruth doesn't have to bring it right away, because it's not going to make a difference if she brings it right away, because we're not going to go by that value. And Abishau, who says she should bring it right away, is because the depreciation is going to be on the nizak, on Naomi. Okay. What's the logic to saying? Okay, let's talk about the logic, the conceptual idea here. It makes a lot of sense to say it's on the nizak. Why it makes sense to say it's on the nizak? Because in the end, what is damage? Well, it was worth 300, now it's worth 100. And we go, it doesn't matter when the court rules, it matters what Ruth did. Ruth took an animal that was worth 300 and she made it worth 100. Now, the fact that by the time this whole thing is over, it goes down in value is irrelevant to the whole picture. Okay, so it actually makes a lot more sense. To say it's the mazik, what would be the logic? To say that in the end, if the animal depreciates, Ruth has to take responsibility for that as well. So the logic would be that for laws of responsibility, the Torah made someone who damages, which would be Ruth in our case, as if she's the owner of this object. You damage something, you become the owner of it. This happens, by the way, we're going to talk about it very soon when we get to a thief. You steal something, which is crazy to think, right? The halacha views you as an owner of that item. Now, it seems crazy. What do you mean? You don't own it just because you decided to be the owner. But in terms of laws of responsibility, yes, you're an owner. What does it mean? Well, what it means is you have to return it at the value in which you stole it. If it goes down in value, that's not your problem. You have to return it. It's as if that moment you stole it, you became the owner. Likewise here, the moment you damaged it, you own that now. So now when the court rules that you have to return it, you have to return it at the value it was at the time from the beginning. So therefore, if it depreciates in value, that's your tough luck. Okay, so there's something to be said there for saying it's the mazik. In the end, the Gemara is going to reject this and say no, or not, at least not necessarily. We wanted to suggest maybe it's machloket tanaim. Is the depreciation on the mazik or on the nizak? But they say lo de kule ama de nizak. It's no, we don't really know. But they're going to now suggest a different way to understand the machloket Abishawal and the rabbis. About another debate between them. We started with the issue of the first issue was who gets to keep the nevela in the end, right? Who's left with the dead carcass? And we said it was the nizak. Now we say, but at what price, right? At what price do we evaluate the time of the death of the animal, or do we evaluate it based on the time of the court's ruling? Now we say, look, perhaps everybody really holds that the depreciation is on the nizak, okay? Because again, who made Ruth the owner of this animal? It's true she caused damage, but we go by the moment she caused the damage. By the way, there's two interesting things in the Rishonim that I saw. One is the Rosh says it goes from the time that the owner became aware of the damage, not necessarily the time the damage happened, but when Naomi found out that her animal died, that's the moment, which is interesting to think about. And then Nimukei Yosef says that what does depreciation mean? Depreciation can mean two things. One is the animal now, reeks as time goes on and is worth less. Nobody really wants to deal with it. Or I don't know, for some reason, that animal went down in value in itself. Or it could be price fluctuation as well. Could be just the price of those animals and the dead carcasses and the shuk went down. That also is going to be counted as depreciation. It's either or. Don't think it's just that this animal went down in value, but if the price in general dropped, still it's going to be on the nizak, okay, Naomi's problem. So now they say, what's the machloket then between Abba Shaul, who says bring it to the court? Now remember, who's the subject of that sentence? The mazik. Ruth should be bringing it to court, okay, right? If Ruth killed Naomi's animal, Ruth should bring it to court to be evaluated. Well, now what's the focus here? And the fact that Tanakama doesn't say that, what's the debate? It's who is responsible to actually bring the animal to court? I don't know if you thought about it until this point, but you got to bring this animal, this dead ox, let's say it was an ox, pretty big animal, you got to schlep that to court. That's a pain in the neck. Okay, you might have to hire someone to do it. You might have to, use favors from your friends who are strong people and help them help you schlep it. Who's supposed to do that? Is it Ruth's responsibility or Naomi's responsibility? So that's the machloket between Abba Shaul and Tanna Kamma. Abba Shaul says, Yaviu, right? Yavi'ehu aid. And this, by the way, right? Yavi'ehu, bring the animal as testimony. Now, what's Yavi'ehu aid? Bring the mazik, the one who was watching it and didn't do a good enough job. Ruth, she has to bring this animal to the court. And Tanna Kamma doesn't say that's the meaning of the pasuk, says no, it's on Naomi to bring it. So how do we see this? Well, it actually appears in a Braita that there's a machloket about this. Now we're only going to see one side, but it's going to start with acherim omrim, which means others say. Others say, we often say as Rabbi Meir, but also it means someone disagrees. Minayin she'al baal habor laha'alot shor miboro. We're going back to that same pasuk, and again making a different drasha. This pasuk says, right, return the money to the owner, if you, right, the owner of the boar. In this case, we're going to say Ruth dug a pit, Naomi's animal came in and died, and Ruth has to pay back the money. And then it says, V'hameit yelo, remember, which means that Ruth only has to pay the amount the animal was worth now from then and the amount the animal was worth now, the difference. But now they darshan it a little differently to teach you another halacha, which is kesef yashiv lebalav, meaning Ruth has to give money back to Naomi, v'hameit. Instead of saying v'hameit yelo, this is a classic type drasha where we put the comma in a different place. She returns money to the owner and the dead person, the dead animal, okay? And the dead, meaning she has to bring the dead herself to the court. That's what you see. It's Ruth's responsibility to bring the animal. So now we have a great question. I don't know that Rabbi Elazar. So we're assuming now it's a debate. Does Ruth have to bring the animal? Does Naomi have to bring the animal? Now, they're saying, what kind of burden is the Torah teaching you that the burden is on Ruth? Well, okay, this is just classic logic. If the animal, now we're going to forget my 200, 300 and all that, 100. We're going to now take the amounts they say here. Let's say an animal, remember, bringing the animal, let's say it was a pit, means getting the animal out of the pit, which is not so easy either, and picking it up, right, out of a pit and taking it out. Now, if we say that the Torah specifically has a unique drasha to teach us that don't think that Naomi has to do it, Ruth has to do it. But you don't need a pasuk to teach you that. Just like we said earlier, you don't need a pasuk to teach you something else, the pchat nevela. Also, you don't need a pasuk to teach you this. Why? It's just simple laws of economics. An animal, if I sell you on the street in a dead carcass, okay? Now I sell you a carcass that's sitting on the road, or I sell you a carcass that's in a pit. What's going to be the price difference, right? Is there going to be a price difference? Of course. If I sell you and I say, listen, I'm going to sell you this dead carcass, and what a carcass is dead. Sorry, I keep saying dead carcass. I sell you this carcass, animal carcass. Basically, if I say it's in the bottom of a pit, well, you're going to say, well, then I'm charging, right? I'm going to pay you less money for that, right? Because I'm going to have to, it's going to cost me. This is like when you want to sell your house, you paint it first, even though theoretically, right, the person who comes in can paint it themselves, but you're going to paint it and then jack up the price more than the price of what you painted the house for, right? That's just the way it works. So basically, of course, it's in Ruth's best interest to take the animal, the carcass, out of the pit, because she's going to, in the end, now why? Because if an animal's worth one in a pit, one out of the pit and 4 in the pit, well, again, what's the issue? She has to pay the difference, right? I'm sorry. If it's worth, did I just say it wrong? I said it wrong. It's worth 1 in the pit because, right, who's going to buy a dead animal in a pit, right? They're going to have to spend money. So you're only going to be able to sell it for 1. But if you take it out, it's worth 4. Now it's in Ruth's best interest. She's only paying, let's say the animal was worth 10 when it was alive. So if she doesn't take it out of the boar, it's only worth 1. So she's going to have to pay 9. In this case, it's dinarim, okay? 9 dinarim or 9 zuzim, which are all the same. She's going to have to pay 9 zuzim. If she takes it out, she's going to have to pay only 6 because it'll be 10 minus 6 is minus 4 is 6. So now, of course, Ruth is going to be the one to take it out of the pit. Obviously, it's going to be worth a lot more if she can take it out of the pit, just like if she paints her house, she'll be able to sell it for more. So therefore, since that's the case, You don't need a pasuk to tell us simple laws of economics. It's obviously in her best interest. She's going to do it anyway. She's going to be the one to do the Torah. So therefore, there's no reason to teach you this halacha. So, right, that's what it says. Ki tarach b'denafshe tarach. The tircha is all for her benefit, okay? Because the price differential, right, it doesn't cost her 3 zuz to get it out. But again, no one's going to want to buy it in a pit knowing they're going to have to possibly hire people and get it out and all that. So therefore, it's obvious the Torah is on her, whether, right, regardless of what the halacha is going to tell you. So So they're saying, no, they're telling you that if for whatever reason, the animal is worth the same in the pit and out of the pit, then the onus is on Ruth, to which they say, is there possibly such a thing that you could buy it for the exact same price? To which they say, they say, yeah. Some people say it's possible you could buy a beam in the city for the same price you could buy it in the fields. Even though you're going to have to schlep it from the fields to the city, sometimes it costs the same. Okay, so it could be there's a case where it's the same, and in a case where it's the same, still they're telling you it's on Ruth to do it. So what we saw here was, number one, the issue that even though you might have thought otherwise, the nevela stays with the person who's damaged, and Ruth only, right, the one who damaged only pays the differential, and it's on them to return it. We kind of said, well, isn't that obvious? Because the one who damaged, like Ruth here in our story, could pay with dead animals anyway. But anyway, they taught it because they wanted to teach you the second issue, which is pchat nevela. The depreciation is also on Naomi. And then we talked about who's the Torah, who has to bring the animal to court. And that we suggested was that's in the end, we said is possibly a machloket. Okay, we saw very clearly the opinion that that Ruth would have to bring it to court. And then we said, well, isn't that obvious that she would do it because it's in her best interest financially? But in the end, we said, right, even if it's not in her best interest financially, it doesn't make a difference. Still, the onus is on her. By the way, I'll just point out, bringing it to court and taking it out of the pit are two different things, even though the Gemara seems to compare them as if they're one and the same. Okay, now we're moving on. Amar Shmuel, in Shamim. Okay, Shamim means we evaluate the value of whatever this item is, right? So now he says, Ein Shamim lo l'ganav v'lo l'gaznan, ela l'nizakim. Let's say you stole my item and broke it. Then we don't do this whole thing of evaluating what it's worth now, and you're going to pay only the deducted amount, right? You're going to deduct the amount of what it's worth now. No, if Ruth steals Naomi's animal and then the animal dies in Ruth's possession, Ruth has to return the full amount of the animal at the time of the theft to Naomi. Okay, whether she's a ganav or a gazlan, we'll get into all the differences between them later on in the Masechet, Perek Meruba, later on in Bava Kamma. What's the logic here? So there's two possible reasons to say this. Okay, so now they're saying ela l'nizakim. So this whole thing of shamin is only in damages, not in theft. So damages are classic damages, right? And theft is I stole it or Ruth stole it and then damaged it. Okay, so now we're going to say the following. Let's talk about two possible reasons why a thief is different. The first reason is, well, a thief is way worse than someone who damaged. A thief does, right? He stole it, right? Or she stole it. Ruth steals something and then damages. That's much worse, right? They shouldn't have stolen it. What was it doing? It wasn't like a shomer where I gave it to her to watch and she just didn't do a good job. Or it wasn't like, we were walking on the street and she just happened to, her ox gored my ox. But no, it's a case where she stole my animal and then damaged it. So that's already, by the way, it's not even just damages. It could be she stole it and something happened to it. Okay. But it's way worse because she stole it and therefore we're penalizing Ruth. And it's a penalty. It's just because she did something terrible. The second answer is what we've talked about before, which is, and it's very strange, but a thief becomes, and we're going to talk about this a lot more later in the Masechet, basically ends up being an owner of the item. And that's why when they have to pay it back, they basically become the new owner. So the shards or the carcass, all that becomes theirs. And therefore they have to pay the full amount at the time of the theft. Now you might say, what do you mean? You steal my item and you become the owner? But what it means is exactly this. You become the owner for loss of responsibility. It's, you are now the full owner. So when something happens to you, you have to return me the full amount. You don't tell me, oh, here, take your shards and, you can sell them and I'll just pay you the difference. No, it's you've become the owner and therefore you pay me the full amount. And that's why also the pchat is on you, the depreciation, because you stole it from me. I want to get it back the way it was at the moment it was stolen. So therefore, Shmuel says very simply, not for Ganav Gazlan, this whole law we just learned, only for nizakin, only for damages. But then he adds, V'ani omer, af l'shoel. But I say it's also true for the shoel, for one who borrows. V'abba modeli, and Rav, Abba he uses as a term for Rav, agrees with him. Now, there's a bit of a problem with what he says, because there were two things. We don't do Shuma for Ganav Gazlan. We do it for damages. And I say even for the shoel, even for someone who borrows. Ibayalahu, so they asked the question on what Shmuel said. Hachi ka'amar. Is this what you said? Af l'shoel shamim va'aba modeli. Even a shoel, we evaluate the item just like damages. O dilma hachi ka'amar. Or maybe what he meant to say was v'ani omer af l'shoel ein shamin va'aba modeli. Or does he mean the shoel is like the thief? Okay, if I borrow an item and something happens to it, I'm like a thief, basically. Now, what would be the logic either way? Okay, well, to put it in the category of the nizakin seems logical because he's a shomer just like everyone else, and he's in the category. But then again, why would you have to single him out then? It seems a little strange. Singling him out would be to say, wait, the shoel is different. Now, why is a shoel is a borrower? A borrower in general, when it comes to laws of shomer, we're going to get to all the different laws and all the different who's responsible for what. A shoel is the most responsible. Why? Because of two things. Number one, they're borrowing something to use, okay, whereas usually a shomer is just watching something, is not allowed to use it. They're borrowing it to use. Number two, they're not paying for its use like, let's say, a renter. A renter is borrowing something to use, but is paying you for it. They're not paying. They're getting all the benefits. They say, kol ha'na'ashelo, all the benefits are on the shoel. And therefore, they have a higher level of responsibility. And the Ramban even goes so far as to say that a shoel becomes like he bought something temporarily. It's like he owns the item right now. It's as if it's in my possession fully. Well, that would make sense to compare him to the ganav, because he basically becomes the owner of the object. And therefore, all these laws of Shuma and let's evaluate it and deduct it are irrelevant because he becomes an owner. That's to say he's like a ganav. If you say the ganav is only because they did something wrong, well, the shoel didn't do anything wrong. They didn't, right? Now, they did something wrong because something happened with the item in their possession. I borrowed your car and a terrible car crash happened and I happened to be in the middle of it. It wasn't my fault. Right? I didn't do anything wrong. It's not like I stole your car and then got into a car accident. That would be much worse because I stole your car. What was I doing with your car? Shoel didn't do anything wrong. So you could see the logic of both directions. So now the Gemara is going to say, Tashma, let's learn from the following case. And they quote a case that happened. Who gavered deshal narga mechavre? I think a narga is an axe or a pick or something like that, some sort of tool. He borrowed a tool from his friend, Tavra, and he broke it, okay, like the car. He took your car and I got into a car crash. Ata the kamei de Rav. So they go before Rav. Amar le zil shalim le narga ma'al. Go return him a perfectly good tool, the same one you stole, which sounds like, right, the broken tool is irrelevant. Whatever the parts that are left are worth, we ignore right now, right? It doesn't get deducted. So shmamina ain't shamin. It sounds like it's more like someone who stole something. To which they say, no, what are you talking about? That can't prove your point. It's going to prove the exact opposite because you obviously missed the end of the story. After Rav Paskin like that, Rav Kahana and Rav Asi came in, were maybe sitting in court, and they said to him, "Is that really the law? What did you just do?" To which, what was Rav's response? Vishati. Rav didn't respond. Now the assumption here is he didn't respond because he thought they were right. And then Shma Mina Shamin. It sounds like we do deduct the amount. So in the end, they seem to be concluding, and we're going to see that they paskin this way, the way Rav Asi and Rav Kahana reacted to Rav, that really shoel is like the regular categories of damages, and it's not like a ganav gazlan, and you would deduct the amount of what the parts are left, what those parts are left. Okay, itma. Now we're going to say, just in case you weren't confused enough with the different opinions here, again, we have it's clear ganav. We don't do any evaluation, they pay the full amount. It's clear for damages, they evaluate and they deduct. The machloket we saw was about the middle case, about the show. But now Ulla comes and says in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Shamim leganavu legazlan. Even a ganav and gazlan only pay the difference. And the original owner is left with whatever broken parts there are, a dead animal or whatever it might be. Rav Pape Amal ein Shamim, but he disagrees. And Hilchata ein shamin lo leganav lo gazlan, and the halacha is, in fact, as we saw before, ignoring Ulla in the name of Rabbi Elazar, which makes sense, by the way, because they were from Israel, and we're in Babylonia here. Aval l'shoel shamin k'de Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi, and the psak is like Rav Kahana and Rav Asi, that the shoel is more like the one who damaged. Okay, so now we quoted, and this is going to be the lead into the rest of our daf, which has absolutely nothing to do with our topics. Ulla here quoted Rabbi Elazar. And in fact, in the Yerushalmi, we're now going to have 5 other cases where Ulla quotes Rabbi Elazar on totally unrelated topics, and they're all brought here. Why are they brought here? So according to the Yerushalmi, these are all cases. Ulla was one of those people who came from Israel to Babylonia, and he used to bring the Torah of Israel to Babylonia. He said lots of things in the name of Rabbi Elazar. Why these in particular? So according to the Yerushalmi, these were all cases that Rabbi Yehuda asked Ulla, what does Rabbi Elazar have to say about this? And Ulla answered. So that it were cases that Rabbi Yehuda specifically wanted to know from Ulla what Rabbi Elazar said. So the next case needs a little bit of a background. If a woman miscarries, and we don't see any sort of fetus coming out, okay, and we're assuming this is after day 40, because then the vlad is already somewhat formed. So there's but we do see a placenta type thing coming out of her body, okay? How they see this, we're not going to get into all the gory details, but a placenta comes out of her body. Maybe she sees it, right? So she sees a placenta coming in. Now, the issue is a woman who miscarries has to keep as if there was a birth, okay? It's now I'm not remembering if it's 40 days or even 80. I think it's after 40 days. So she has to keep, okay, you could say it's the amniotic sac, okay? The amniotic sac comes out. The question is, can we assume that there was a fetus? Because we saw an amniotic sac, so can we assume there was a fetus there? So the assumption is that ein shilya below vlad. There was definitely a fetus. That's the assumption. Okay, now, after day 40, what happens is this. We already have to assume that now she's bleeding. Okay, now bleeding could be, you anyway there's all sorts of laws of purity and impurity if a woman is bleeding. But now we have to be concerned that, okay, I see people are writing different things. You could call it placenta, you could call it amniotic sac, you could call it, in the Quran, they use the word afterbirth. Okay, it's something that usually comes after the baby comes out. So whatever we call this, we'll call it a shilya to make it simple. So a shilya, there's no such thing as a shilya without a vlad. That's an assumption the sugya is making, which is we assume that a vlad came out, that there was a fetus in there. Once there's a fetus, woman has to wait days of impurity. Okay, now the way it works for a woman who gives birth, okay, is that number one, you have 7 days if it's a male, 14 days if it's a female. Now, obviously here, if there was no noticeable fetus, then you don't know if it was a boy or a girl. So you have to be strict and wait the 14 days and not the 7 days. So she can only go to the mikveh after day 14. But another halacha is that in boys, there's the next, after the first 7 days, the next 33 days until day 40 after the birth, if you bleed in those days, it's called dam tohar. We don't keep this anymore because of other issues, which we'll learn all about when we get to Nida. But those 40 days, those 33 days after, if she bleeds, she went to the mikveh after day 7. This is a woman who knows she had a boy. She went to the mikveh after day 7. Then she waits 33 days. Those 33 days, she actually is allowed to be with her husband. She could touch things. She doesn't make them impure. The only issue is she can't go to the temple yet, okay, and eat sacrificial meat, which at the end of her 40 days, she brings the korban yoledet, and then she can eat the sacrificial meat of the korban. That's her korban that she's supposed to bring. If it's a girl, it's 14 days, and then she has 66 days where it's called dam tohar. Now, if you're not sure boy, girl, then it's tricky because you keep the first 14 as if they're dam tameh, but then you only keep till day 40 as dam tohar, because otherwise if she bleeds day 41, if it was a boy, it would be actually problematic blood that would normally make her tameh. If it's a girl, then it's dam tohar. So we have to be strict in both ways. So again, what would happen? 14 days of days of impurity, 16 days of dam tohar, and then until she can go to the temple, it's only after the 80 days are up. So that's, if you didn't get all the details, it's okay. But the point is this woman, we're going to say right now. So let's start with Amar Ulla Amar Rabbi Elazar. Okay, so now the question is where we start counting these 14 and additional 26 days and even the 80 days, because there's 3 issues, right? When she ends the dam tameh, which days are going to be tahor days, and when is she going to be able to go to the temple? Okay, so now, in this case, the problem is, now, again, one more thing you have to know. A shiliyah comes out, we assume there was a vlad. And we can even be concerned that maybe the vlad, one option is the vlad came out and we just didn't see it. the fetus. The other option is that the fetus dissolved into this shiliah. And then the question is, now there's a law that when do we determine it? Let's say it takes course over a few days when the majority of the fetus comes out. Well, if this shiliah came out over a course of 2 days, we don't know when the majority of the body of this fetus came out. So again, it's a little gross, this whole thing to think about, but let's just deal with it. So shiliah sheyatzah miksatah b'yom rishon miksatah b'yom sheni. So part comes out the first day, part comes out the second day. Part comes out, let's say, on Sunday, part comes out on Monday. Monim lami min harishon. You start counting from day one. We assume, in other words, again, assumption number one, there must have been a vlad in the shiliah, or it was an indicator that there was a vlad that came out. And number two, we assume the majority came out on day one. To which Amalei Rava, madatech l'chumra, what you're saying, we have to be machmir that maybe it all came out on day one. But chumra da'ate l'day kulahu. But that's a chumra that's going to lead to a kula. Why? Because if you start on day one, then you're going to end a day early. And then your dam tohar is going to start a day earlier, which is blood. You're going to say, well, maybe if it really came out, and we don't know when the majority of the body came out. Maybe the majority of the body came out in day two. So while you're being machmir in one sense, that we're already calling you tameh, you're being lenient because your day is going to end a day earlier counting. So what does Rava himself say? Right, and then he explains why the kamatar lemi rishon, because you're going to start the dam tahor 14 days from the first day and not 14 days from the second day. So elam Rava lachush chosheshet mimna lo mimnia ela l'shin. So no. What I mean is you have to be concerned that the first day she's tameh, but you're really only going to count your count from the second day. And that way you make sure to cover all your bases. So now they say, okay, well, my kamashon, what are you trying to teach us? That there's no such thing that part of a shiliah comes out and there's no vlad in it. If you want to teach us that, well, we learn that somewhere else. Okay, now why? Why is this the assumption of what they're teaching? Because if it's possible that some of a shiliah could come out without there being a vlad, then you would have two sfeikot here. When there's two doubts, then we actually rule leniently. Number one, we would say, did the vlad, was it in this part of the shiliah or was it not? And number two, even if we assume it did the majority come out or not? Because it's only once the majority comes out. So that would be two sfeikot, and then we'd be lenient. And that's not what we're doing here. So it must be because you assume for sure a vlad, if a shiliah comes out, there must have been a vlad with it. If that's what you're saying, well, there's no such thing as part of a shiliah coming out without there being a vlad in there at all. And then it only becomes one safek. Did the majority come out or did it not? Well, and then we'd be strict. Tanina, we already learned that in a case about an animal. Now we're going to talk about a different topic, which is an animal that you slaughter a female animal who's pregnant, and there's a fetus, a fully grown animal inside. Well, or even less than a fully grown animal. You don't need to slaughter that animal. You can eat that animal without slaughtering. It's called a ben pikuah. But if the animal put its head out or the majority of its body out and was like about to be born and then went back in, once the majority comes out, it can no longer be covered by the shchita of the mother. And then it needs a separate shchita if, it's worthy of eating. So shiliah sheyatzah miksatah asura ba'achila. So now they say, if there was this shiliah that comes out of the animal, it's the part of it comes out, it's forbidden to eat. Siman v'la b'isha, siman v'la b'behema. And then they say it's the same thing, right? Now, even if it doesn't have even if you don't see a vlad in there, it's forbidden because, again, if it came out and let's say went back into the body of the animal, it's as if it came out before the slaughtering, and therefore you can't eat it without slaughtering it, okay? Or, in this case, it's not covered by the shchita of the mother. And then you wouldn't really be able to eat it because it's like something that came from a non-kosher animal that wasn't slaughtered, okay? It would be a part of the animal that wasn't covered with the slaughter of the mother. That's because a shiliah that comes out, we assume there's a vlad inside. And therefore, right, if it wasn't a vlad, it wouldn't really matter. But because there was a vlad inside, and then we have to be concerned that maybe the majority came out already, then you can't eat it. So now they say, isn't that the same thing? To which they answer, if you wanted to learn from there, moving down Amabet, it could be that you could say the following. Maybe there is miktzat shliya b'lo. You could have this, whatever we want to call it, afterbirth or shliya that comes out without a vlad in it, but we wanted to say that if a little bit comes out, we're going to forbid it, not because we necessarily think that there is something there, but because if we allow it, if it came out a little bit of it came out, then you might think that if the whole thing comes out, it's okay as well. And that for sure is not because the whole thing for sure has a vlad in it. But the question is, what about miktzat? And that's why we're not sure if part of a shaliyah might not have a vlad in it. Well, that's why you needed Ulla to tell you, no. Every miktzat shaliyah has a vlad in it. And don't think that this is forbidden, this case of the Mishnah, because it's just exera. No, it's actually forbidden because we hold that there is no such thing. Every part, a little bit of the shaliyah comes out, we have to assume there's a vlad in there definitively, and not maybe there is, or maybe we have to be strict or something. And that was the first halacha. The other ones are a little bit simpler. Amar Ulla Amar Rabbi Elazar. B'chor shenitraf b'yom shloshim yom. Okay, maybe they're a little graphic as well. This isn't so pleasant topics. Miscarriage, child being attacked by animals. But we have a little baby who's a firstborn. And within the first 30 days, he gets attacked by an animal and eaten. Some people say they have to choose that case because it was very common that animals would attack little babies. I don't know if that's true or not, but in any case, they bring this case. Now, we'll see in a minute why specifically nitraf, but it could have been something else. Some people actually think it means something else entirely. Tosfot has a different explanation, but we're going to go with the Rashi. Ein podimoto. Now, you're supposed to redeem a firstborn son on the 30th day, right? Or after. Now, why 30 days? Because they weren't sure if the baby was going to be viable until they lived for 30 days. That was their sense in those days. You have to wait the first 30 days, only then is it viable. I mean, also because the Torah says it, but the assumption is the Torah says it because it's viable. So once it gets to day 30, you're obligated in pidyon haben. Now, the question is, what happens if we never knew if the child was viable or not because it was attacked by an animal? It got killed for some other reason, not because it didn't live, because it couldn't survive, but because it was attacked. Now, maybe and it's why 30 days? It's 30 days because we weren't sure if it was viable. So it could be the father is obligated to do the pidyon even after the death of the baby, because theoretically, right, it was likely this child was going to live had it not been attacked by the animal. Of course, you don't really know, and that's why in the end, since we don't have proof that the child was going to be viable or not, therefore you don't actually do the pidyon. He also brings it from a bride to the same halacha that Ulla brought in the name of Rabbi Elazar. Because it says padotifdeh, which sounds like in any case, usually when something's double, we say in any case. You might have thought even a kid that's attacked, a baby before day 30, Talmud lomar ach. It says ach padotifdeh, which means but, meaning there's some sort of chilek, meaning not every case. Okay, so this case where it might have been likely it would make it to day 30, but he didn't for some other reason. Well, still you don't do pidyon. This is something we saw in Kiddushin. A large animal is acquired by pulling the animal. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? How could he say that? It says in the Mishnah, b'misira. Remember, you just have to, because it's hard to pull a big animal, and they might pull the other way. So the way you transfer authority, ownership is by giving the reins to the other person. And once they have the reins in their hands, that's enough. So they say, so how could Rabbi Elazar say something against the Mishnah? Well, very simply, Hud Amar Ki Aitana. Titania, he holds by the following brighter. We saw this also in Kiddushin. Chachamim oblim zo v'zo b'mishicha. Big animals and small animals are actually done by pulling, even though it might be hard to do. The rabbis say in a brighter, yes, it's by pulling. And Rabbi Shimon omer zo v'zo b'hagbaha, by lifting. Remember we talked about the elephant, right? How you lift it. Anyway, also by lifting, which is much more hard to imagine. But anyway, the point being that Rabbi Elazar holds like the rabbis in that braita, even though it goes against the Mishnah. Next halacha. Amar Ulla Amar Rabbi Elazar. Ha'achim shechalku masha aleihem shamim u'masha al bneihem u'bnotehem ein sham. Brothers come to court. They want to split the inheritance of their father. But in the meantime, before they got to court, they took money from the inheritance and they bought clothes with it because they needed clothes to wear. So they bought clothes with it. Well, we deduct the amount of the clothing they're wearing. And the assumption is that what they're wearing is what they bought, okay? That didn't have like 50 different outfits, but they had one shirt that they basically wore. And we deduct that amount if they took it from the inheritance. So if you spend $50 on a shirt, we're going to deduct that from your portion. If you spend 30, deduct. But not what the children are wearing. It's very interesting. And some people say also not the wives. Why? Because the assumption is we don't want to bring them to court to have to, it's embarrassing to bring the kids to court to show their clothes that they're wearing. In fact, the Yerushalmi says the Bigdei Shabbat they would bring. Why? Because the Bigdei Shabbat weren't on them on the day they went to court, because they went to court during the week. So they had two sets of clothes. One was Shabbat clothes, one was everyday clothes. The everyday clothes they were wearing, we're not going to schlep them to court. It's humiliating for them to stand up in front of court with their clothes and everyone evaluate. But the ones that we could bring, we could bring. There are some cases that even the ones they're wearing, we won't. For example, like for example, the older brother, he might have a fancy suit. Why is that? All the brothers agreed to let him have this fancy suit because he's the one who's dealing with all their father's property and he needs to look presentable in court. Let's say he goes. So that might be an expense that all the brothers equally share, and therefore we're not going to deduct that. It's a funny kind of thing. It actually comes up in other sugyas about how, there's a certain amount of clothing, like a wardrobe budget that, the person in charge gets because we want them to look presentable in court. Amar Ulla Amar Rabbi Elazar, Shomer Shemasar l'Shomer Patur. Ruth gives Naomi something to watch, and Naomi decides she doesn't really want to watch it. She gives it to Yael without consulting with Ruth. And then while it's with Yael, something happens to it. So if she passed it on to Yael, she's exempt, Naomi, even though Ruth gave her the responsibility. If Naomi wasn't getting paid by Ruth, but Naomi paid Yael to do it, and Yael is kind of taking more responsibility, because she's doing a better kind of shmirah. Not even that case, but even if Naomi was getting paid and she passed it on to Yael and didn't pay her for it, still she's exempt. Nami patur, right? Even though she lowered the level of shmirah, still she's going to be patur. And this goes back to the case of the cheresh shoteva katan. If you pass it to someone who's not capable of watching, you're responsible. But if you pass it to someone who's capable of watching it, we assume they're going to do a good job. And if something happens, it's their fault, not yours, as the middle person. But Rav Amal, he disagrees. Shomer shemasar l'shomer chayav. And he goes in the reverse. He says not only is Naomi for sure responsible, but not even if she lowered the shmirah, but even if she was a shomer chinam and she gave it to a shomer sachar, she gave it to someone who was actually, she's paying her for it, she's still chayav. Because Ruth could say to Naomi, I give it to you because I believed you. Now what happens? If something happens, let's say it gets stolen from Naomi's house, she'll take an oath and swear that it was stolen, and then she gets exempt, because as long as she takes an oath about it, she's believed, and she's not liable if it's stolen, for example. So let's say she's a shomer chinam anyway. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the details. But Ruth could say, I don't trust this Yael. I don't know. Maybe she lies in court. I don't have anything to do with her. Abai actually offers a different explanation, which comes up somewhere else, which is Ruth could say, I don't want my item someone else watching it. I trusted you. I don't trust her. So it's either trusting to watch it, according to Abai, according to Rabbi, it's trusting to take an oath. Amar Ulla Amar Rabbi Elazar. So that's a machloket between Ulla, quoting Rabbi Elazar, and what Rabbi says. Last one for today. Amar Ulla Amar Rabbi Elazar. Hilchata govin mina avadim. You can take money from a loan. Instead of taking my land, you could also take my slaves. Amar le Rav Nachman leUlla. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Afilu miyatme. Did he say even from Yatomim? Because remember, what did we learn about orphans? If the father owed money, they can only take it from land that the father had at the time that he died. So can you also take it from slaves? Right? Is that considered like land? Now, there's all this debate, is a slave like land, or are they like movable property? They're kind of in the middle, and that's what the sugya is dealing with. So they say lo, mine. No. We're talking about from the original owner, and the guy who took the loan out, not if he gave it to his orphans. Orphans, you can only take land, not slaves. We're talking about Canaanite slaves that were part of the owned by the person. To which they say, then what's the chiddush of what Rabbi Elazar says? It's even if it's from the person who took the loan, you can take any metaltalin from him. If you lent me money and I don't pay back, you could come take the cloak off my back as payment for your loan. So of course you could take my slaves. So what's the chidush? To which they answer, and we'll stop here for now, but it's if I made the slave and I said, I'm borrowing money from you, you're going to collect it from this slave. And then I sold it to somebody else. Okay, that's the chidush here. That it's like land to that extent, that it could be liened if I specifically said you're going to collect it from the slave. As Rabbi said, I said you're going to collect it from the slave, and then I sold my slave, you can collect it from that slave. But if I did it with my shore, and then I sold it, and what's the reason? Because everyone will know that the Ever was an apotiki, but they won't know about the shore, and therefore when they went to buy it, the buyer had no idea. But with the Eved, he should have known. It would have been known, and therefore he knew, and therefore you could collect it from the Eved. And that's right now the way we're going to assume this means. Tomorrow we're going to see them understand it in a different way. So what we did today, we're talking about the Nevela in the beginning part, and then we moved to these other statements of Ulla in the name of Rabbi Elazar, all sorts of different statements of things he quoted Rabbi Elazar as saying. Wishing everybody a good day, hoping for good news.